The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. My name is Al Blumkin. I'm the host of another segment of Pittsburgh Sports Now. With me is my co-host, David Finoli. And today we're going to discuss David's new book. Just came out a couple of weeks ago on Pittsburgh's greatest teams. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Al. How you doing this afternoon?
Okay. Is it going to get cold up by you next couple of days?
We're looking at our last day of 50s, and we're gonna back into the low 30s and 20s.
Yeah, we're gonna get that after tomorrow here in New York.
So
how's the book?
More football-like weather.
Right.
The book is doing very well.
Good.
And very, very well received in the papers. And I mean, this was all the things I've done. This was my passion. This is what I've always the book I've always dreamt of doing, and I'm just so happy the History Press gave me the opportunity.
Yeah, it's finally coming off the Steelers' improbable win last night.
Oh boy, that was not exactly a good endorsement of the NFL watching the game, but
no,
got to give the team credit for coming through such adversity and somehow pulling out a win.
Yeah, I was very surprised when I saw it this morning because I turned it off at 17-0 yesterday. Yeah, I mean, it was just they were just doing so much nothing in the first half. And I knew the linebacker Shazier was hurt. And one of the guys posted on Facebook that this may be a Pyrrhic victory. So I said, what? Victory? What kind of victory? And because I went to sleep assuming it was 2013 loss. And then, I went into the NFL web and I saw 23-20. I said, what?
Oh, yeah. They give them credit. The defense found ways to get around the injuries and played inspired in the second half.
Oh, they have another night game coming up. This week.
Yeah. They get a little old after a while.
In Pittsburgh, and it'll be a night game Sunday. That'll make the paying customers very, very happy.
Oh, I'll be there, and I'll be bundled.
Good. You're going to need it. Anyway, let's get started. David, I'd like you to discuss how the book came about and what criteria you used in ranking these particular teams. Then we'll get into the individual sports after the general overview.
You got it. Probably in the early 1990s, once the internet was becoming a good place for reference sources, I wanted to sit back and look at every Western Pennsylvania champion at the college level and above, because I've never seen a compiled list. So I started with what I thought was going to be a 2-week venture, and 25 years later, I'm still finding odds and ends teams from the early part of the 20th century to include in the list. So probably about 10, 15 years ago, I set about trying to rank who the best teams had been there. And after I had got my first couple books published, I tried to sell that one. And for whatever reason at the time, it was a tough sell. So I kind of put it in the back pocket and went upon the subjects that I've written about ever since. And by chance, I was talking with a member of the History Press after Arcadia Publishing had bought them over. And, we were coming up with a few ideas, a couple of things they thought they liked and came back to me and asked for something else. So I decided for whatever reason, just out of the blue, to pitch them this one that I hadn't really pulled out of the file since probably 2003 or 4. And they loved the idea. And they allowed me to do it in the format I wanted. And most importantly, they allowed me to put the list that I've been compiling for 25 years on my own to publish somewhere. So There's a list of 205 champions that I've come across in Western Pennsylvania from the earliest was in the late 19th century to the Penguins. The Altoona Curve didn't make it into the book from this year, unfortunately, because of the publishing deadline, but the Pittsburgh Penguin 2000 championship was the 205th.
And what determined your rankings?
What
was
I did,
it difficult, or in some cases, or was it easy?
There were some easier ones, but for the most part, I went through and I ranked. I picked the major teams first off, and tried to rank the top 15 teams in the history of each. Then I would go through and look at things such as historical context. How a team such as the 78 Steelers would rank all time as compared to the 2005 Steelers, and I would look at situations where was this historical? Was this a champion that you can look down at and say, is this one of the greatest all time, or is this one of the great historical teams of all time? Once I got those through, I went back with my research and looked at some of the one-timer teams, a team such as Harmarville, which was the greatest soccer team in the United States in the 50s, and teams like the Hornets, which was the hockey team in Pittsburgh until the year the Penguins became an NHL team. The Pipers, which is a team that seems to still, 50 years later, as we're in the process of celebrating their 50th anniversary of their ABA championship, and certainly it was the first ABA champion, and you can look back and still have claims to the greatest ABA champion. So we did that, and then I sat down and tried to put them in order. And let me tell you, over the course of writing this book, there wasn't a day or two go by when I would look at some of the research I was doing and kind of maneuver teams back and forth. And then, of course, the 2017 Penguins threw everything into chaos as they came into won their championship right after the manuscript had been done. So I had to go back. Thank God the history press didn't want to look dated, so they allowed me to go back and include the 2017 Penguins and throw everything into chaos a little bit. But over the course, 50 teams, there were probably about 60 or 70 teams at one point in time that were in there that I would move out once I did some more research on another team. But it was a fun process, and it's fun to talk about with people and get their takes and different opinions on who they think, which is, to me, the real joy of writing books that rank teams and players.
Yeah, I've always found that from my own personal standpoint, ranking is something I've stayed away from as much as I could, because everybody has their own opinion, and when you set it out, you let people know. In a certain situation like Facebook, I won't respond to rankings or comparisons because I don't want to get into any shouting matches with people.
Oh yeah.
But anyway,
I find that mostly they're very civil and interesting conversations, and quite frankly, I have a group of about 8 or 9 friends that I bounce these off of, and we go back and forth. And in a couple of instances, they throw out some good points that maybe change my mind a little. So, the idea is this is, and I always point out when I do a rankings book, this is my opinion. It's not a set in stone.
Yeah.
This is what it is. But my intention is more to celebrate these teams. Whether you believe one should be, because to me there's a fine line between number 30 and say number 5. You can make an argument for anybody in those cases, but to me it's a way to celebrate these teams and their accomplishments, some of which have been well forgotten by time.
Okay, let's get into the individual sports. We'll start with baseball. And I saw in the book you had all 5 Pirate World Series champions, plus the 1901 and 1902 Pirates, who did not have the opportunity to play in the World Series because there wasn't any. and I think 3 Homestead Gray, 3 Negro League teams you put in there also.
Yes.
So could you give us some of your thinking on why, say, example, the 1960 Pirates is not rated all that high, and some of the other teams, what your reasoning was for fitting them in where they did?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the 60 Pirates, if you're talking about great stories, they would be up or near the top. But when I went through to rate the Pirates, and I mean, the 1971 team with such great players, such a great offense, and a good pitching staff. 79 was a tremendous offense, and again a very good pitching staff. 60 might have had a slightly better pitching staff than those two, but not remarkably. But the offensive comparisons between 71, 79, and 60 are just, to me, were a significant difference. In 1909 and 1902, to me, those were the 2 greatest teams. 1902, of course, you have the argument that, well, the AL rated most teams and left the Pirates somewhat alone, and that would obscure the stats a little. But to me, I look at it as the base of that team in 1902 was the same as 1909. I thought the pitching was much better in 1902, although 1909's was pretty good too. I mean, you had these guys at their prime in 1902. You had Lever and Felipe at their primes, and Jack Cheesebro, who went on to win Major League record 41 games with the Highlanders, who became the Yankees a year or two later. And of course, Jeff Tannehill, who was a great two-way player, a good hitter, and certainly a dominant pitcher. So that's why I chose 1902 over 1909, and I thought the collective combination of those teams were better than the other 3. So that was my thinking as I went through to rate the Pirate teams. 1960 to me was more a great story than what I'd look down and see. This was the best collection of Pirates in the history of the franchise.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. When you look at it objectively, the 1960 Pirates captured a lot of people's favor because of not only this team that seemed to have talent that was somewhat limited, won the pennant, but the way they had won the World Series, which was just the further away you get from that, the more unbelievable it seems.
Oh, it was, and not once can I look at that team and think to myself, well, this was the best team in baseball. It was a great team and a great story to win the World Series, but if you look on paper, I mean, you can say the other 4 Pirate championship teams were the best team, or either the best team or had an argument to be the best team in baseball. I think the Pirates were more a great story than necessarily a great team.
Okay, can you discuss the 3 Negro League teams that you put in there? That you put in there?
When I mean, Negro League baseball, by people like you and me who discuss these things, we understand the greatness of it, but it gets lost in time a little bit. But at any given time, these teams had 6 or 7 Hall of Famers on them. And when you talk about the greatest Negro League teams of all time, your conversation usually is including the 1931 Homestead Grays and the 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords. Both are selections in the Negro Leagues, and certainly great rivals at the time. The Crawfords taking many of the players from the Grays when Gus Greenlee was really intent on building the greatest Negro League team in the game. And then conversely, when his empire started going under financially, the Grays recovered those players before they eventually, during the war, would become the Washington Homestead Grays, eventually playing most of their games in Washington. But in the one connector between these 2 teams on both 31 and 35 was the great Josh Gibson, who many who have seen him will argue and have a good argument that he was not only the greatest hitter in the Negro Leagues, but the greatest hitter of all time. Unfortunately, you don't have a ton of eyewitnesses to that, so a lot of it are legendary. But he certainly was effective against when the major league teams would play them in barnstorming postseason contests. Gibson would certainly show just how effective he could be. Bob Feller, who I had interviewed once for my book on the war, he was just a crotchety guy who didn't really seem like he liked talking to people, but he would give me one-word answers until I brought up the Negro League, and he was a proponent of bringing the players into Major League Baseball and would barnstorm with them quite regularly. Well, when I asked him about the Negro Leagues, he lit up, and he started talking very enthusiastically about it. One thing I never forgot was he told me, Dave, everybody thinks Josh Gibson would have hit 700-800 homers. I'm telling you, he would have been a great player, but not to that level because he couldn't hit the curveball. He could only hit a fastball.
Wow.
Which was some great insight. But again, how many people did hit Bob Feller's curveball? So, but these guys, Cool Papa Bell, the fastest player in baseball at the time, if you listen to the eyewitness accounts. Oscar Charleston, Judy Johnson, the third baseman, Buck Leonard. These were Buck Leonard and Oscar Charleston were considered, great all-around hitters.
Yeah, the Ruth and Garrett of the Negro Leagues.
Absolutely. And Satchel Paige, who was on the 34 Crawfords before a contract dispute sent him out to Bismarck for 35, had played for a little with them. Leroy Matlock had an undefeated season for them in 35. But they were certainly among the greatest teams, not just in Negro League ball, but in baseball. And certainly had, I would consider myself remiss if I didn't rank them as high as I did.
Okay, now let's get to football. We can do this in two segments. We can do it in professional and then college. So we'll start, obviously before 1974. The 1974 season, the Steelers had no championships and no teams that even remotely belonged there. But once the Steelers made their first Super Bowl in 1974, it started a period of excellence, which is still going on right now. So can you discuss the 6 Super Bowl Steeler teams and what you felt was the difference between some of the Bradshaw, Franco, Harris teams, and why one of those was ranked higher than the other?
Absolutely. And you're right. 72 was the first time in 40 seasons that they actually won a division title. Before that, they had one season where they played in a postseason in 1947 with the great Jack Sutherland at the helm, and lost to the Philadelphia Eagles. I want to say 21-0 in an Eastern Conference championship game when the two teams tied for the title. Other than that, it was embarrassing history for all intents and purposes. But what my thought process was in '74, to me, again, like 1960 is to many, to me 74 is the most memorable championship, but not the greatest. It was a good defense. It was a team that was not living up to the lofty heights they thought they could. And at one point, Joe Green was frustrated and left the team thinking they'd never make it to the Super Bowl. Wide receiver coach Lionel Taylor had talked him back in, and eventually they settled down and they became magnificent in the playoffs, limiting teams to minimal yards rushing. The Raiders, the Bills, and the Vikings, the defense just really dominated. But the difference with that team was the offense was not what it would become. It was Bradshaw. Gillum started the season, was magnificent in their opener against Baltimore, and then in a tie against Denver the next week, he was wonderful again. I believe threw for over 300 yards that game, which back then was quite an accomplishment. But after that, it kind of sputtered. Harris had a good season. The quarterbacks never really came to play, and in the playoffs, Bradshaw was solid, if unspectacular. So to me, that was the difference between that being the bottom of the four teams. And then in 79, that would be probably the third-place team, because you could see age was cropping up defensively on this team, and they were becoming stagnant defensively. And in 1980, you saw it full force, the age of that team coming around. But in 78, to me, that was the most perfect Steeler team there was. The offense was devastating. Bradshaw had come into his own, and they mostly dominated teams throughout the year. And then realistically, while the Super Bowl was a close game in the end, it was close only because Dallas scored twice late to make it a close game. But Steelers were up 35-17 at one point, and really, you never had a feeling that they were not going to win that game. So that team is the one that always comes in the comments when a Steeler team is talked about as one of the greatest of all times. And in fact, in the 90s, when ESPN was doing a tournament of the greatest teams, the Steeler team actually, their experts had dubbed the Steelers to be the winners. So that's why that team was the greatest. 75, in my eyes, was a dominant, probably the best defense we had of the Super Bowl champions. And then after that, 2008, which everything they were put up against, that defense was so incredibly dominant, but injuries had decimated the team, had hurt them badly, but they kept winning. And they kept winning, and Tomlin would say it was winning ugly, but in the end, that was one of the greatest defenses ever produced by the Steelers. Playing what was at the time the hardest schedule for a Super Bowl champion. I want to say it's second or third at this point, but it was a very difficult schedule too. And then 2005 to me was another great story. Not necessarily a team I look down at in the annals of any NFL history and say, man, this was one of the great teams. But you know what? They won a Super Bowl after, a 16-year absence from
yeah.
Oh, not a 16. What am I?
No, they were in there in
26.
96 with Dallas with Neil O'Donnell. Yeah.
Oh, no. Yeah, but I mean winning a Super Bowl. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, that was the first time since the Wes Bradshaw team, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean we were waiting 20-some years for one for the thumb, and that to me that was up there with 74 as one of the most satisfying moments.
Yeah, that was the Jerome Bettis season.
Absolutely. I just played remarkable in the playoffs against Indianapolis, a team that was heavy favorites, and then, thoroughly beating Denver for the most part, even though they made a late comeback. And, they got a little help from the ref in the Super Bowl, and Roethlisberger was awful, but, again, made the plays when they had to.
Okay, now in college, I saw that you ranked a whole bunch of Pitt teams, most of whom were before either of our lifetimes. I think the only two ones that I even remember were actually seeing were the 76 national champions and the 1980 team. But you had a lot of teams from the early history. Plus, one thing I wanted to ask you about, there was actually a team in there from Carnegie Tech.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Carnegie Tech, there's I want to say either a 1.5 or 2.5 mile ride down Forbes Avenue between.
Yeah, I know that, yeah.
Carnegie.
They're on the other side of Finley Park, yeah.
Right, and you went there, you were right there.
Yeah.
But in the 30s, these three teams were among the top 20. I mean, you had to drive that 2-mile drive to see three of the best 15 teams in the country. I mean, it must have been just a remarkable time to be a college football fan. Carnegie Tech in ended up wanting to de-emphasize football, which led to where they're at right now. But in the 30s, they had a couple remarkable wins against Newt Rockne in the 20s. I'm sorry, had a couple remarkable wins against Newt Rockne and Notre Dame, and then in the 30s, late 30s, became the best team in Pittsburgh. They were one of either the first or second Lambert Cup champions, defeating Pittsburgh and only Notre Dame, which was a fluky mistake by the referee, cost them a victory against Notre Dame. That was the only thing between them and a national championship in 1938, at least being ranked number one going into the Sugar Bowl, where they faced Sammy Baugh and the number one TCU Horned Frogs, actually leading them at the half before Sammy Baugh finally came through with a clutch second half. But, that 38 Carnegie Tech team certainly as a Lambert Trophy champion goes down as a memorable team, which is why they're included.
Could you discuss some of those early Pitt teams?
Sure.
Go ahead, please.
When Pop Warner and Jock Sutherland, they were, of course, two of the greatest coaches ever to grace a sideline in college football. So between 1915 and 1938, when Jock Sutherland was forced out, the best football in the country, Pittsburgh was the Alabama of college football. And they were also, people, certainly talk about the recruiting advantages to schools such as SEC schools that might, gloss over rules to recruit some of the higher players. Well, in that time period under Jock Sutherland, that was the Panthers. They were criticized hastily over the years by many of the big schools for paying their players. In fact, it was said that their players could afford just to play football, have a house, and be married with a family off of what the stipend Pitt gave them for playing. So, as much as things change, you still have very similar stories.
Yeah.
But, there's no doubt that those teams were remarkable. Jock Sutherland winning 5 national championships between 1929 and 1937, with the 37 team being considered by many as one of the greatest in college football history. With a green backfield of Chicarno and Goldberg and several others. But 36, they won their first bowl game. They had a history of losing in the Rose Bowl by, except for their first trip to the Rose Bowl where they lost to Stanford on a controversial play 7-6. They pretty much got waxed by USC in their Rose Bowl history after that. Back then, they didn't really consider bowl games more than exhibitions, so they didn't wait till after a bowl game to name a national champion. They would name it before, and actually a lot of Pitt's national championships until 1937 were named after retroactively to when they won, because a lot of these guys would do research and name national champions for years that there might not have been selectors or many selectors, but they are recognized by the university and recognized by college football because of the research done, which was mainly done in 1966 and with the Sports Illustrated article by Dan Jenkins, who I had the pleasure of talking to when I was doing my article over the Pitt national championship teams, over my book, over those national championship teams during that time period. And, that was where a lot of these schools picked up the national champions they claimed because of the research that was done that day. In an article, basically, because of the controversy over Michigan State and Notre Dame, which prompted the research. But nonetheless, Pitt had just some great champions back then. One in 1934 has been probably the most controversial one. There was a gentleman who had picked the champions for the Spalding Guide, which the Spalding Guide at that point was considered probably the premier college football authority in the game, and he would pick his champions every year. Well, in before the 1934 season, he passed away, and they were named by him as the college football champions for 1934. So disputed for years because that team had, of course, the man had passed away the year before. But as we found out when I actually went back and purchased on eBay some of these books and found out it wasn't him that named the champion. It was Spalding Books, or the Spalding Guide, that had named them champion in 1934, which actually gave them more credence for the title. But back then they just used the same type because it was probably expensive to change it year in and year out. So they basically used the same thing they've been using and just added a name at the end, which is why it was erroneously credited to him and not the Spalding Guide. But those teams were among the greatest, certainly in the game. 36 and 37, only lost to Duquesne in an upset in 36, and two of the infamous three consecutive ties against Fordham, which had some great teams back then, where there were only blemishes. And then, of course, 76 versus 80. Sporting News is, and most of the research I did always puts 80 ahead of 76 because of the competition they felt was much greater in 80 over 76, despite the fact they had lost the one game to Florida State, 36-22 that year. But my thought process is, they did that all, but you know what? Pitt ended up winning all their games and doing what they were supposed to, and quite frankly, with Dorsett and Kavanaugh and Gordon Jones, and certainly a solid defense that Al Romano was a consensus All-American that year. That's why I put 76 above 80, because quite frankly, maybe they played a little less of a schedule, but they dominated every team they played, and they dominated the good teams, Georgia and Penn State and Notre Dame, the three really good and nationally prominent programs they played that year.
Okay, David, let's go on to hockey. I saw that you had the 5 Penguins Stanley Cup winners, including the one this past season, which you just talked about before, that they held the publication up so you could get that team in there. Plus, there was a Penguins team that did not win the Stanley Cup, that won what they call the President's Trophy, and there were a couple of Hornets teams. Can you go into that somewhat, please?
Absolutely. In '93, they were coming off 2 championship seasons, and Scotty Bowman, again widely considered the greatest coach in hockey history, was their coach that year, and that team had, I want to say, 6 or 7 Hall of Famers on it. They were all at their peaks. They all performed at peak value that year. And if not for a fluky loss in the second round against a much inferior New York Islander team, the 7th game being decided in overtime, they would have gone down among the top 3 or 4 teams in NHL history. It was I wanted to represent at least one of the great professional teams that came close and didn't pull it out, namely being the 03 Pirates, the 76 Steelers that went on a defensive streak that's been unrivaled, and in the 93 Penguins. In each case, definitely with the Steelers and Penguins, you could argue for the fact that those were the best talent and best regular seasons. But to me, what made the Penguins the one that ended up in this book over the 3 was the fact, and at one point in time, they all 3 were in the top rankings. But one thing that kept the Penguins in there was the fact that you could still argue for this team as one of the greats in NHL history from a talent standpoint. And I'm not sure you could do the rest with the other 2. But we got those guys in there. Hornets, The NHL, when the Hornets were in the AHL, there were only six NHL teams. So to me, the AHL was the equivalent of the Pacific Coast League during the 30s and 40s. Many considered that close to an equal, if not an equal, of Major League Baseball, because many great players stayed out there because the PCL paid decently, and I guess people wanted to stay on the West Coast.
Yes, the better lifestyle, because the Coast League in those days, they'd have Mondays would be a travel day, and they spend the entire week. And if they were on the road in some other place, they played the games, single games Tuesday through Saturday, and a doubleheader Sunday. So they were in at Sacramento or Portland or Seattle or wherever for a week without having to travel, and they paid better than in a lot of cases than the major leagues did. Ferris Fane, who won the bank title in the American League in 1951-52, always said that he had to take a cut in 1947 to go from the San Francisco Seals of the Coast League to the Philadelphia A's.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are good points. Very good points. The AHL was certainly considered major along the same lines. But more or less just because of the lack of teams in the NHL more than what the PCL, which was probably a stronger league in comparison because of what they gave their players. But the Hornets had some great teams back then, and certainly were deserving of an honor. And to me, the favorite of the group was the one that won the '67 Calder Trophy, which was their last year. They knew the Penguins were coming, so there wasn't a spot for them in Pittsburgh, and they were hoping to catch on in another city, but nobody was interested in taking them. So as the playoffs came, they weren't necessarily the best Hornet team of all time, but they knew their time was near, and somehow in the playoffs they played their best hockey of the year and won an exciting overtime game, and the last game ever, AHL game ever played in Pittsburgh, and Hornet game. The Wilkes-Barre came here a couple times, so can't say it's the last AHL game, but the last Hornet game, and they ended up winning the Calder Cup in their swan season, and you give that team a lot of credit, but they certainly were not what a traditional minor league franchise would be. It would be tough to put an Altoona Curve in here because of the level they play at, but when the Hornets were playing, it was at a top level.
Okay, let's go to basketball. Okay, I saw you put in a couple of Pitt teams from the Stone Age, and a couple of Duquesne teams, and then the pros. You had as you mentioned earlier, the Pittsburgh Pipers, who won the first ABA championship. Pittsburgh did have a team in the NBA in their first year for 1 year called the Ironmen that did not do very well. And they had a team when I was attending Pitt in the short-lived American Basketball League called the Pittsburgh Wrens, who Connie Hawkins played for.
Right. And you had mentioned before you had seen Connie play in
high school, yeah,
playgrounds in New York,
yeah,
and what a tremendous talent! What a unfortunate circumstance that he wasn't part of the NBA early on. He chose Iowa. He was accused of knowing somebody who knew gamblers, and was basically blackballed from college and the NBA. So the Pittsburgh Wrens allowed him to start his professional career in the ABL, and when the ABA started in the 66-67 campaign, the Pipers, who were the Pittsburgh franchise back then, were lucky enough to sign him in his prime. And here was a guy that, in an era where you were still, playing set ball instead of athletic ball, this was a guy much ahead of his time. Probably one of the most tremendous athletes ever to play the game, especially during that time period. And he was the MVP of the league that year. They went something like 55-24 at a dominant team, and then he tears, I want to say the meniscus in his knee in game 4 or 5. And I think it was 4 because game 5 they ended up losing, and I believe he didn't play that game. But he puts a brace on and comes back and has a game of his life in game 6 in New Orleans with Pittsburgh down 3-2, sending it to a 7th and final game here and just gutted it out. And again, one of the most inspirational, gutsy performances, those 2 games. And leads the Pipers to a victory in Game 7 in what was almost a sellout to win the ABA championship that first year. And I think, with Hawkins on that team and some of the good players they had, they have a legitimate shot at claiming themselves as the greatest ABA team ever to play. Unfortunately, George Mikan wanted a team in Minnesota. The original Minnesota team left after the first year, and they ended up going to sending the Pipers to Minnesota in the second season. And when they returned a year later, they were a shell of themselves, and eventually were renamed the Condors and went down as one of the worst teams in Pittsburgh sports history.
Okay, let's finish up with the odds and ends teams, the teams that went out in these 4 sports that you include.
Not a problem. Okay. I will mention 2 teams real quick before we get into that. The 27-28 Pitt team, which there was no tournament back then, the basketball club. There was no tournament back then, but this team was headed by Coach Carlson, who was considered an offensive genius at the time, which even though the offenses were only in the 30s and 40s, they were certainly light years ahead of what other teams were playing. That team went undefeated, and a young player, I believe he was a sophomore at the time, named Charlie Hyatt, who would become their only 3-time All-American, was the star of that team. And to me, that is the greatest college basketball team we've ever seen. Second greatest would be the 55 Duquesne Dukes, led by Hugo Green, which is another New York legend, and Dick Ricketts, a team that without those 2 were basically a marginal team at best. But those 2 were so good that they became the only Pittsburgh-based Division I college basketball team to win a national championship in a tournament, which they did in the NIT, which in the 50s was the equal of the NCAAs. Now, some of the other teams we put in, there was Pittsburgh was in the 40s and 50s, and even the 30s were considered the soccer city or one of the top soccer cities in the country, winning what today is called the Lamar Hunt Trophy, which all United States-based teams, professional, and some of the borderline professional teams will play in it, and to name the best team in the United States. Well, now it ends up being mostly an MSL-dominated thing, but back then it was a great competition throughout the country, and it really, the MLS champion now is who's considered the greatest team, but back then, who won this tournament was considered the greatest, and the last Pittsburgh team to do it was in Harmarville, who were a bunch of amateurs and beat a professional team from Chicago in the title. It was a 2-game match where the aggregate score would win, and Pittsburgh scored 2 goals late in the second half and then one in an overtime to overtake a big lead that their opponents had come against them. So we had that. We had the triangles, which was World Team Tennis, which most people aren't aware still goes on now. But back then you had the greatest players in the world. We had Yvonne Goolagong and Vitas Gerulaitis and Peggy Michael, who all were either Hall of Famers or were significant players at the time. Goolagong, fresh off a Wimbledon victory when she played for the Triangles. And, that was a team that certainly, if you look at just the significance of the players who played on it and in that league, that was a long-forgotten championship that Frank Fury, who's a great businessman in the Pittsburgh area, still today owned. And, we can celebrate that team. But those were just some teams that certainly I think deserved included in mention in this book.
Okay, David, thank you for the overview. I think we covered most of the important items in the book. And would you like to tell people in the audience where you can get the book?
Absolutely. If you're in the Pittsburgh area, most Barnes & Noble will have it. I know I just did a signing at the Penguin Bookshop in Sewickley, and I'm even going to a place called the bookstore in Cumberland, Maryland, this Saturday to have a book signing. Have a book signing there at 10 in the morning. But also, you can get this book and the rest of my books on Amazon too, by just typing in my name, and they will all appear. But we've had some great fun with this. As I said, I'll be there on Saturday, and then on the 13th, I'll be at the Barnes & Noble in the Waterworks Mall, and on the 16th, I'll be that night at 6, and then at 4 o'clock on Saturday the 16th at the Homestead Works Barnes & Noble. Okay,
very, very good. I want to thank you for this podcast, and I'm glad I got it right this time. So thank you again. Thank you for not getting all over me because of what happened last Thursday. And I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll talk soon, maybe possibly about the Steelers and their chances for success at the playoffs.
You got it, Al.
Okay. Take care. Thank you very much.
Take care, too.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you later.